Some moments in life break your heart wide open before they heal it in ways you never expected. When Clara Morrison found a starving donkey chained to a tree in the New Mexico wilderness, she thought she was simply witnessing cruelty that needed fixing. The animal's ribs showed through his matted coat, but his eyes held something that stopped her cold. He wasn't afraid of her approach. Instead, he stepped forward with heavy chains dragging, as if he'd been waiting for her specifically. These weren't simple ropes someone had used carelessly. Someone had chained this gentle creature with thick iron links meant to last. As Clara knelt beside him, she realized this wasn't just about an abandoned animal. The way he looked at her suggested he was guarding something important in this remote canyon. But what could be so precious that someone would chain a donkey to protect it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Morrison had always found her truest self in places where cell phone towers couldn't reach. At 42, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of navigating both wilderness trails and life's unexpected detours. Her hiking boots, now dust-covered and worn soft at the heels, had carried her through 3 states and countless miles of healing. Solitude since her divorce became final 6 months ago. The morning sun painted the red canyon walls in shades of amber and rust as Clara adjusted her pack, straps, and consulted the leather-bound journal she'd carried on every major hike for the past decade. Its pages chronicled weather patterns, wildlife sightings, pressed wildflowers, and the gradual evolution of a woman learning to trust her own compass again. Today's entry began with coordinates and elevation markers, but her handwriting grew looser as she described the crisp October air and the way morning light transformed the New Mexico landscape into something that belonged in a cathedral. She had planned this 3-day solo trek through Copper Canyon as a celebration of sorts, her first major adventure since the papers were signed and her ex-husband's belongings finally cleared from their suburban garage. David had never understood her need for these wilderness excursions, viewing them as impractical escapes from responsibility. "You can't solve everything by running away to the mountains," he'd said during one of their final arguments. Clara had learned he was wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about so many things. Her background as a veterinary assistant had ended when budget cuts eliminated her position 3 years ago. But the skills remained embedded in her muscle memory: how to approach a frightened animal, how to read pain in creatures who couldn't speak, how to offer comfort without overwhelming a nervous system already pushed to its limits. These days, she worked remotely for a software company, managing databases and client communications from the small apartment she'd rented after selling the house. The work paid well enough and offered the flexibility to disappear into wilderness areas for days at a time, which had become less luxury than necessity for her mental health. Clara's pack contained everything needed for self-sufficiency: water purification tablets, emergency medical supplies, weather-appropriate clothing layers, and enough dehydrated meals to sustain her for 5 days if necessary. She'd learned to pack light but comprehensively, understanding that preparation often meant the difference between adventure and catastrophe in places where rescue might be hours or days away. The trail ahead wound through a landscape that seemed designed to humble human concerns. Towering red rock formations jutted skyward like ancient prayers, their surfaces carved smooth by centuries of wind and water. Juniper and pinon pines clung to impossible ledges, their roots finding purchase in cracks smaller than a fingernail. Clara had studied topographical maps for weeks before this trip, memorizing elevation changes and water sources, but no amount of preparation could capture the spiritual weight of walking through geology that predated human civilization by millions of years. As she rounded a bend, where the trail descended toward a grove of cottonwood trees, Clara's trained eye immediately recognized that something was wrong. The donkey stood motionless beside the largest tree, his head lowered but alert. Even from 50 yards away, she could see the unnatural angle of his posture, the way his weight shifted to accommodate restraints that shouldn't exist in this wild place. Clara approached slowly, speaking in the soft, consistent tone she'd learned calmed nervous animals. "Easy there, friend. Let me see what's going on." The donkey's ears swiveled toward her voice, but he didn't startle or pull away. Instead, his dark eyes tracked her movement with an intelligence that made her chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't a wild burrow that had somehow become entangled. This was a domestic animal, someone's companion, left alone in a place where solitude could mean death. The chains that bound him to the cottonwood were substantial, the kind used for serious restraint rather than temporary tethering. Each link was thick enough to resist bolt cutters, and the connection points showed signs of professional installation. Someone had meant for these chains to last, had planned for this donkey to remain exactly where he stood. The implications of such intentionality made Clara's stomach turn, with a mixture of anger and confusion. She knelt beside the animal, running experienced hands along his neck and shoulders, feeling for injuries while assessing his overall condition. His ribs were visible through a coat that should have been thicker for the season, but his muscle tone suggested recent adequate care rather than long-term neglect. His hooves were properly trimmed, his mane showed signs of recent brushing, and despite his obvious hunger, his eyes remained bright and responsive. "Someone's been taking care of you," Clara murmured, more to herself than to the donkey. "So where did they go?" Her hiking journal, when she consulted it, contained no mention of livestock in this area. The trail maps showed wilderness designation with no private property markers for miles in any direction. Yet this donkey's calm acceptance of her presence spoke of deep familiarity with human companionship. He didn't flinch when she examined his restraints or checked his hooves for stones. If anything, he seemed grateful for the attention, pressing his muzzle gently against her shoulder when she stood to survey the surrounding area. Clara's practical mind catalogued the immediate concerns: water, food, shelter, and the growing realization that her carefully planned solo retreat had become something far more complex. The nearest road lay 8 miles behind her, accessible only by the narrow trail she'd followed into the canyon. Her cell phone showed no signal, and the emergency GPS beacon in her pack was designed for life-threatening situations, not animal welfare cases that might have perfectly reasonable explanations. But as she looked into the donkey's patient eyes, Clara understood that reasonable explanations felt increasingly unlikely. Someone had chained a trusting animal in a place where help might never come, then vanished without leaving obvious signs of intention to return. The weight of that abandonment settled over her like a physical presence, heavy with implications she wasn't ready to fully consider. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the canyon rim, painting longer shadows across the red rock landscape. Clara's original plan called for another 6 miles of hiking before making camp near a reliable water source marked on her maps. But standing beside this chained donkey, watching him turn hopeful eyes toward every sound that might herald the return of whoever had left him here, she knew her plans had fundamentally changed. "Looks like we're going to be spending some time together," she told the donkey, adjusting her pack and beginning to scan the immediate area for a suitable place to set up camp. "First thing tomorrow, we'll figure out how to get you free." The donkey's ears pricked forward at the word tomorrow, as if he understood that his long wait for rescue might finally be approaching its end. Clara made her first camp circle, checking for level ground and adequate drainage, but her eyes kept returning to the animal's patient stance beside the cottonwood tree. In the growing twilight, with shadows deepening across the canyon floor, the scene took on an almost mythical quality. Woman and beast, strangers bound together by circumstance and the simple recognition that some burdens were too heavy to carry. Alone, as Clara unrolled her sleeping bag and began preparing for a night she hadn't planned to spend in this particular place, she found herself wondering whether she'd stumbled upon this donkey by accident, or whether some deeper current of need and purpose had guided her footsteps to this exact spot at this exact moment. Either way, she was here now, and tomorrow would bring decisions that might change more than just one animal's fate. Dawn arrived with the kind of clarity that only exists in high desert country, where thin air and vast distances create light so pure it seems to ring like crystal. Clara woke to the sound of the donkey moving restlessly against his chains, a metallic scraping that had infiltrated her dreams throughout the night. She'd camped close enough to monitor him, but far enough away to avoid making him nervous, and now she could see that his water situation had become critical. The first priority was hydration. Clara approached with her collapsible water bowl, moving slowly and speaking in the same gentle tone that had calmed nervous dogs and cats during her years at the veterinary clinic. The donkey drank deeply, desperately, confirming her suspicion that whoever had been caring for him hadn't returned in several days. She refilled the bowl twice before his thirst seemed satisfied, each gulp making her more certain that time was running short for this animal. With water addressed, Clara turned her attention to the chains themselves. In daylight, their professional installation became even more obvious. The metal was high-grade steel, resistant to rust, and designed for permanent attachment. The connection point at the tree had been secured with a heavy-duty lock that would require specialized tools to remove. Someone had invested considerable effort and expense to ensure this donkey remained exactly where he stood. But as Clara examined the restraint system more closely, she discovered something that shifted her understanding of the situation entirely. Partially buried in the sandy soil near the tree's base lay a rusted metal water bucket, its handle bent but still functional. The bucket showed signs of regular use, worn spots where rope had rubbed against the rim, mineral stains consistent with daily filling and emptying. Someone had been bringing water to this donkey on a schedule, treating his confinement not as abandonment but as temporary care. The implications troubled Clara more than outright neglect would have. This wasn't random cruelty or thoughtless abandonment. Someone had made a deliberate decision to chain this animal in a remote location while maintaining his basic needs, suggesting circumstances she couldn't yet understand. The donkey's calm acceptance of human presence, his obvious training and socialization, painted the picture of a beloved companion rather than livestock being stored for convenience. Clara spent the morning exploring the immediate area, searching for additional clues while the donkey watched her movements with intelligent eyes. His behavior struck her as distinctly unwild. He showed no fear of her presence, no attempt to graze on the sparse vegetation within his reach, no signs of the hypervigilance that characterized animals accustomed to predator threats. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, as if his chaining was temporary and he expected someone familiar to return. That someone's recent presence became evident when Clara discovered the remnants of a small campsite 50 yards downstream from the cottonwood tree. A circle of stones marked where a cooking fire had burned regularly, and the ground showed the compressed patterns of a tent or bedroll used repeatedly over time. Personal items scattered by wind and animals suggested hasty departure rather than careful packing. A tin cup caught in sagebrush, a wool sock faded by sun and weather, a paperback book with pages swollen by moisture and time. The donkey's reaction to Clara's exploration of the campsite was the most telling discovery of all. As she moved through the abandoned area, collecting items and trying to piece together their story, he became increasingly agitated, pulling against his chains and making soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like attempts at communication. When she approached the spot where the tent had obviously stood, the donkey's distress became unmistakable. This was where his person had lived, and his chains prevented him from following Clara into that space. Clara knelt in the sand, where someone had slept under the stars for what appeared to be an extended period. The compressed earth told a story of routine, of someone who had made this remote place into a temporary home. But the scattered belongings and the donkey's obvious anxiety suggested that departure had been neither planned nor voluntary. Something had happened to interrupt a careful arrangement, leaving this loyal animal to wait for a return that might never come. The ethical weight of the situation settled over Clara like a physical presence. Her original hiking plan was rapidly becoming irrelevant, replaced by a complex rescue scenario she felt uniquely qualified to handle. Her veterinary background, her wilderness experience, and her current life circumstances, remote work, flexible schedule, no immediate obligations, aligned in a way that felt less like coincidence than destiny. But taking responsibility for this donkey meant accepting a burden that extended far beyond the immediate logistics of freeing him from his chains. Clara had no legal claim to the animal, no knowledge of his ownership status, and no clear understanding of the circumstances that had led to his abandonment. Intervening could mean involving authorities, disrupting carefully laid plans, or potentially separating the donkey from someone who might still return for him. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, making the metal chains too hot to touch comfortably, Clara made her decision. She retrieved her satellite phone from her pack and composed a carefully worded message to her sister Jenny, the only person who might worry about her extended absence from civilization. Found situation requiring extra time. Animal welfare issue. Will contact when resolved. Don't worry. She hesitated before hitting send, knowing that this message represented a fundamental shift in her carefully ordered post-divorce life. The donkey seemed to sense her commitment. As Clara began setting up a more permanent camp, arranging her gear for an extended stay rather than a single night, his restless movement against the chains subsided into patient watchfulness. She established a routine, water every few hours, gentle grooming with a brush from her emergency kit, one-sided conversations that seemed to comfort them both. I don't know your name, Clara told him as she worked tangles from his mane with patient fingers. I don't know who you belong to or why they left you here, but I know you don't deserve to be alone. The donkey's response was to lean into her touch. Accepting comfort from this stranger who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been simpler. As evening approached, Clara found herself studying the donkey's intelligent eyes and wondering what he had witnessed in this remote canyon. His calm acceptance of circumstances suggested experience with hardship, but his continued trust in humans spoke of care and affection that ran deeper than mere animal husbandry. Someone had loved this donkey enough to ensure his safety, even if their method seemed extreme to outside observers. The campfire Clara built that night burned in the same stone circle left by the donkey's previous companion, a choice that felt like honoring whoever had cared for him before circumstances intervened. As flames danced against the canyon walls and stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Clara began to understand that her solo retreat had transformed into something entirely different. A rescue mission that might save more than just one abandoned animal. The donkey settled into sleep gradually, his chains preventing him from lying down completely, but allowing enough movement for rest. Clara watched his steady breathing and felt the weight of responsibility settling into her bones. Tomorrow would bring decisions about bolt cutters and veterinarians and possibly law enforcement. But tonight she was simply a woman, keeping vigil beside a patient animal who had learned to hope against hope that help would eventually arrive. Clara's second morning with the donkey began with a discovery that would reshape her understanding of the entire situation. While searching for a suitable place to build a more substantial shelter, she found a hand-carved walking stick propped against a boulder 20 yards from the abandoned campsite. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Intricate wildlife carvings wound around the shaft in a spiral pattern, each animal rendered with the kind of detail that spoke of both artistic skill and intimate knowledge of desert creatures. The walking stick's handle had been carved from a different wood, darker and more polished from years of handling. Burned into the wood in careful letters were the initials RM, followed by what appeared to be a date, 2019. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the wear patterns that suggested this had been someone's constant companion for years. The care invested in its creation spoke of time and patience, qualities that aligned with the careful campsite arrangement and the obvious attention paid to the donkey's basic needs. The donkey, whom Clara had begun calling Keeper based on his patient-guardian behavior, showed immediate recognition of the walking stick. His ears pricked forward, and he made soft whickering sounds when she brought it closer to his position by the tree. More telling still, he stretched his neck as far as the chains allowed, trying to touch the carved surface with his muzzle, a gesture so full of longing that Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "This belonged to your person, didn't it?" Clara murmured, holding the stick where Keeper could smell it. His response was immediate and unmistakable. He pressed his face against the carved wood and made quiet sounds that seemed almost conversational, as if trying to tell her stories she couldn't understand. The connection between animal and object was profound, suggesting a relationship built over years rather than months. Clara expanded her search of the area, moving in wider circles while Keeper tracked her progress with watchful eyes. The walking stick had been the first major clue, but it wouldn't be the last. Near a natural wind shelter formed by two large boulders, she discovered what appeared to be a more permanent campsite, one that had been used repeatedly over an extended period. The fire circle here was deeper and more established, surrounded by flat rocks arranged for seating. The ground showed the compressed patterns of long-term habitation, and Clara found herself reconstructing the daily routines of whoever had made this place home. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had lived simply but deliberately in this remote location. A small cache of canned goods, their labels sun-faded, but contents still intact, had been carefully stored beneath a natural rock overhang. Basic cooking implements, a cast-iron skillet seasoned by countless meals, a coffee pot blackened by years of campfire use, spoke of someone who valued quality and permanence over convenience. But it was the personal touches that made Clara's heart ache. A small notebook wrapped in oiled leather contained handwritten observations about weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and seasonal changes in the canyon. The handwriting was careful and precise, suggesting education and attention to detail. Pressed between the pages were wildflowers and leaves, each specimen labeled with dates and locations. This was the journal of someone who had found deep meaning in daily observation of the natural world. Clara's professional instincts, honed by years of research and database management, kicked into high gear. She photographed each discovery with her digital camera, creating a visual record that might prove useful for identifying the campsite's former occupant. The notebook's entries provided a timeline, the most recent dated 3 weeks ago, which aligned with her estimate of how long Keeper had been without consistent care. The donkey's behavior throughout Clara's investigation was increasingly revealing. He remained calm and patient, but his attention was focused entirely on her movements through the campsite. When she approached certain areas, particularly the spot where someone had obviously slept regularly, Keeper's vocalizations became more frequent and urgent. He wasn't distressed by her presence among these belongings. Rather, he seemed to be trying to communicate something important about their significance. Clara's satellite phone, when she climbed to higher ground to improve signal reception, finally connected her to the outside world. Her first call was to the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, where a patient dispatcher listened to her description of the situation and promised to check missing person reports for the area. Her second call was to her sister Jenny, who had begun to worry despite Clara's reassuring message. "You found what?" Jenny's voice crackled through the static. "Clara, you can't just adopt a random donkey because you found him in the mountains. He's not random," Clara insisted, watching Keeper from her elevated position on the boulder. "Someone loved this animal. Someone built a life with him out here, and something happened. I can't just walk away." Jenny's sigh was audible even through the poor connection. "This sounds like you're trying to save everything except yourself again. Remember what your therapist said about taking on other people's problems to avoid dealing with your own." Clara ended the call, feeling unsettled. Jenny wasn't wrong about her tendency to focus on external rescues when her own life felt chaotic, but this situation felt different. Standing in this remote canyon, with evidence of someone's carefully constructed life, scattered by circumstances beyond their control, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be here, that her skills and availability had aligned for a specific purpose. The afternoon brought another discovery that would prove crucial to understanding Keeper's story. While examining the carved walking stick more closely, Clara noticed that the handle felt loose in her grip. Further investigation revealed that the darker wood cap could be unscrewed, revealing a hollow space within the shaft. Her heart raced as she carefully removed a small object wrapped in oiled cloth, the preservation method someone used to protect their most precious possessions in this harsh environment. Inside the cloth was a photograph, faded but still clear enough to make Clara catch her breath. It showed an elderly Hispanic man with kind eyes and work-weathered hands standing beside Keeper, who appeared younger and more robust than his current condition. But it was the third figure in the photograph that made Clara's hands tremble, a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with her arms wrapped around Keeper's neck and joy radiating from her smile. The back of the photograph bore an inscription in the same careful handwriting she'd seen in the journal. Roberto and Isabella with our faithful Keeper, Christmas 2018. Below that, in different ink and what appeared to be a more recent addition, for my dear companion who never let me walk alone. Clara sank onto a nearby boulder, photograph in hand, as the full weight of the situation finally became clear. This wasn't just about an abandoned donkey. It was about family, about loss, about an elderly man who had chosen this remote place for reasons she was only beginning to understand. And Keeper, faithful Keeper, had been left behind to guard something more precious than anyone could have imagined. The sun was beginning its descent toward the canyon rim when Clara made her way back to Keeper's position by the cottonwood tree. She approached slowly, photograph in hand, and watched his reaction when she held it where he could see. His response was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed forward against his chains, making soft sounds that seemed almost like recognition, almost like grief. The photograph changed everything Clara thought she understood about Keeper's situation. That evening, as she prepared dinner over Roberto's carefully constructed fire circle, she found herself studying the image repeatedly, trying to read the story written in the elderly man's weathered features and the child's radiant smile. The love between the three figures was unmistakable. This wasn't a casual snapshot, but a portrait of a chosen family bound together by something deeper than convenience. Clara's investigation the following morning took on new urgency. Armed with Roberto's name and approximate age, she climbed to the highest point accessible on foot and used her satellite phone to conduct more targeted research. The signal was weak, but sufficient for basic internet searches, and what she discovered painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and increasingly complex. Roberto Morales, age 78, had been reported missing from Santa Fe 3 weeks ago by concerned neighbors who noticed his absence and uncollected mail. The missing person report described him as a retired carpenter and widower with no known family, last seen loading camping supplies into an older pickup truck. The report noted that Mr. Morales had been recently diagnosed with a serious medical condition, though details weren't provided in the public filing. But it was the additional information Clara found through social media searches that brought tears to her eyes. A memorial page for Isabella Morales' beloved granddaughter showed the same girl from the photograph, with dates indicating she had died in a car accident 4 years ago at the age of 12. The page was filled with memories from classmates and teachers, describing a bright, animal-loving child who had spent summers with her grandfather exploring the wilderness areas of northern New Mexico. Clara sank onto a sun-warmed boulder, phone in hand, as the full tragedy of the situation became clear. Roberto hadn't disappeared randomly. He had returned to a place that held precious memories of his granddaughter, bringing Keeper as his sole companion. The careful campsite arrangements, the detailed nature journal, the obvious long-term planning all suggested someone who had chosen this location deliberately, perhaps as a way of staying close to memories too painful to bear in the civilized world. When Clara returned to Keeper's position by the cottonwood tree, she saw him with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned animal. He was a living memorial, a connection to a child whose loss had perhaps driven her grandfather to seek solace in the wilderness places they had explored together. The weight of that responsibility, of being the sole witness to Roberto's grief and the keeper of Isabella's memory, seemed almost too heavy for one loyal animal to bear. "You've been waiting for him to come back," Clara said softly, stroking Keeper's neck while he leaned into her touch. "But something happened, didn't it? Something that means he can't come back on his own." Keeper's response was to press his muzzle against Clara's shoulder, a gesture that felt less like seeking comfort than offering it. In that moment, Clara understood that she had found something she hadn't known she was searching for, a purpose that extended beyond her own healing, a responsibility that might help her understand the difference between running away from problems and walking towards solutions. Clara spent the afternoon establishing a more systematic approach to Keeper's care. Using her veterinary background, she conducted a thorough health assessment, checking his teeth, examining his hooves, and evaluating his overall condition. Despite the obvious signs of recent weight loss, Keeper was fundamentally healthy. His gums were pink, his eyes clear, his coat still showing the underlying quality that spoke of years of good care. Someone had loved this animal enough to ensure he received regular veterinary attention, proper nutrition, and daily grooming. The chains remained the most troubling aspect of the situation. Clara's examination revealed that they had been installed with professional-grade hardware, the kind used for livestock handling but applied with unusual permanence. The lock mechanism was beyond her ability to defeat with the tools in her hiking pack, and the chain links themselves would require heavy-duty bolt cutters to sever. Someone had intended for Keeper to remain exactly where he stood, suggesting circumstances that Clara was only beginning to understand. That evening, as Clara prepared for her third night in the canyon, she made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She would extend her stay indefinitely, using her remote work capabilities to maintain her job responsibilities while dedicating her physical presence to Keeper's welfare and the search for Roberto. Her laptop had sufficient battery life for several days of basic work, and the solar charger in her emergency kit could extend that indefinitely if necessary. The practical challenges were manageable. Clara's extensive hiking experience had taught her to pack efficiently for extended wilderness stays, and Roberto's abandoned supplies supplemented her own provisions. Water was available from a reliable spring she'd located upstream, and the established campsite provided adequate shelter from weather. Her biggest concern was communication. The satellite phone's battery wouldn't last indefinitely, and she needed to maintain contact with her employer to preserve her income. But as Clara settled into her sleeping bag that night, listening to Keeper's steady breathing and the distant calls of coyotes echoing off canyon walls, she realized that her concerns about practical challenges masked a deeper truth. For the first time since her divorce, she felt genuinely needed. Not needed in the desperate, codependent way that had characterized her marriage, but needed in the simple, direct way that emergency situations demanded. Keeper needed her skills, her presence, her willingness to stay when leaving would be easier. The next morning brought a routine that felt both strange and natural. Clara woke with the sunrise, tended to Keeper's immediate needs, then spent several hours working on her laptop while seated in the shade near his position. The rhythm of caring for him between client calls and database updates created a structure that her post-divorce life had been lacking. She found herself looking forward to grooming sessions and meal times, to the quiet conversations she maintained with an animal whose responses seemed increasingly articulate despite his inability to speak. Keeper's own routine was revealing. He remained alert and watchful during the day, his attention focused on the trail that led deeper into the canyon system. His behavior suggested not random vigilance, but specific expectation. He was watching for someone in particular, listening for familiar sounds that might herald a long-awaited return. Clara began to understand that his chains weren't just physical restraints, but insurance against the possibility that he might wander away from the spot where Roberto expected to find him. As the day progressed, Clara found herself studying the trail that held Keeper's attention. It led southwest, following the canyon floor toward terrain that became increasingly rugged and difficult to navigate. If Roberto had traveled in that direction, his absence made more sense. The country ahead was unforgiving, the kind of place where a 78-year-old man with health problems might encounter difficulties beyond his ability to overcome. Clara's fourth day with Keeper began, with a discovery that would fundamentally alter her understanding of Roberto's disappearance. While conducting a more thorough search of the established campsite, she found a piece of paper wedged beneath a flat stone that had obviously been placed deliberately as a paperweight. The wind had worked one corner loose, creating the flutter of movement that caught her attention. The paper was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting she'd seen in Roberto's nature journal. But this wasn't a scientific observation or weather record. It was a deeply personal message addressed to "My dear Keeper" in script that trembled with emotion and perhaps physical weakness. Clara's hands shook as she read words that revealed the true depth of the bond between man and animal. "My faithful friend," the letter began. "If someone is reading this to you, it means the time has come for us to say goodbye in a way I hoped we wouldn't have to face. You have been my constant companion through the darkest period of my life, and your loyalty has given me strength when I thought I had none left. After Isabella left us, you were the only one who understood that some grief cannot be shared with the world, that some pain requires solitude to heal." Clara sank onto a nearby boulder, letter in hand. As Roberto's story unfolded, in words that carried the weight of profound loss and difficult decisions, he wrote about the diagnosis that had given him 6 months to live, about his choice to spend that time in the wilderness, places where he and Isabella had been happiest, about his careful planning to ensure Keeper's safety when the inevitable occurred. "I have chained you not from cruelty, but from love," the letter continued. "When my time comes, you would follow me into places where rescue might never find you. These chains ensure that someone will discover you here, where the trail is marked and help can reach you. I have left supplies and provisions for whoever shows you kindness, and I have written instructions for your care tucked away with this letter." The mention of additional instructions sent Clara searching through the campsite with renewed purpose. She found them folded inside Roberto's coffee pot, a detailed list of Keeper's dietary preferences, health history and behavioral quirks, written with the thoroughness of someone preparing for permanent separation. The documents included Keeper's veterinary records, registration papers showing Roberto as his legal owner, and a notarized statement transferring ownership to "whoever demonstrates care and compassion for this animal in my absence." Clara read the ownership transfer document 3 times, struggling to absorb its implications. Roberto had legally prepared for this exact scenario, a stranger finding Keeper alone and choosing to help rather than simply reporting the situation to authorities. The transfer was conditional on demonstrated care, requiring a 30-day period of responsibility before ownership became permanent. But it was legally binding and professionally executed. "He planned for you to find a new family," Clara whispered to Keeper, who had watched her discovery process with increasingly alert attention. "He knew he couldn't take care of you anymore, but he made sure you'd be safe." Keeper's response to hearing Roberto's name was immediate and heartbreaking. He began making soft vocalizations, looking repeatedly toward the trail that led deeper into the canyon system. His body language suggested not just recognition but urgent communication. He was trying to tell Clara something important about Roberto's location. The veterinary records revealed additional crucial information. Keeper was 12 years old, in excellent health for his age, and had been Roberto's companion for 8 years. The documentation included emergency contact information for Dr. Sarah Martinez at the Santa Fe Veterinary Clinic, along with detailed notes about Keeper's personality, training, and special needs. Roberto had approached the transfer of responsibility with the same careful attention. He'd applied to every other aspect of their life together. Clara spent the afternoon absorbing the full weight of Roberto's planning while observing Keeper's increasingly restless behavior. The donkey's attention remained focused on the southwestern trail, and his vocalizations had taken on a quality that Clara's veterinary experience recognized as distress communication. Animals often sensed when their humans were in trouble, and Keeper's behavior suggested that Roberto might be somewhere within range of his awareness, possibly in need of immediate help. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Roberto had clearly intended to die peacefully in the wilderness, having made careful arrangements for Keeper's welfare after his passing. But if he was still alive and in distress, Clara's intervention might be the difference between a dignified natural death and unnecessary suffering. The 30-day transfer period suggested Roberto had expected his decline to be gradual, allowing time for someone to discover Keeper and demonstrate their commitment to his welfare. That evening, as Clara prepared dinner using Roberto's cooking implements and remaining supplies, she made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would follow Keeper's instincts and search for Roberto along the southwestern trail, using the donkey's behavior as guidance. If Roberto was still alive, but unable to return on his own, she might be able to provide assistance or at least ensure he wasn't suffering alone. If he had already passed away, she could ensure his body was recovered with dignity and his final wishes respected. The practical challenges of such a search were significant. The terrain ahead was increasingly difficult, requiring technical hiking skills and potentially multiple days of exploration. Clara would need to leave most of her gear behind, traveling light enough to cover substantial distance while carrying emergency supplies for multiple people. Most importantly, she would need to find a way to include Keeper in the search. His chains prevented him from accompanying her, but his obvious knowledge of Roberto's location made him essential to any rescue attempt. Clara's satellite phone, when she climbed to higher ground for better reception, connected her to Dr. Martinez at the Santa Fe Veterinary Clinic. The conversation that followed confirmed much of what Clara had deduced from the documents. Roberto had been a devoted animal owner who had sought professional advice about end-of-life planning for Keeper. Dr. Martinez had helped him develop the legal transfer documents and had been expecting a call about Keeper's situation. Roberto was very specific about his wishes. Dr. Martinez explained through the crackling connection. He wanted Keeper to have a chance at a new life with someone who would appreciate his gentle nature and intelligence. The 30-day period was designed to ensure compatibility, not just convenience. Roberto believed that the right person would stay long enough to truly know Keeper. The conversation provided Clara with crucial context for her decision. Roberto's planning had been thorough and legally sound, driven by love rather than abandonment. But his current situation remained unknown, and Clara's growing attachment to Keeper made the prospect of leaving him chained while she searched for his former owner emotionally impossible. As night fell over the canyon, Clara settled into her sleeping bag with a plan forming in her mind. Tomorrow she would begin the process of freeing Keeper from his chains, not to steal him from Roberto, but to enable a search that might save the man who had loved him enough to ensure his safety. The bolt cutters she would need could be obtained from her truck, requiring a day-long hike back to the trailhead. But the investment in time would give them both the mobility needed for a proper rescue attempt. Keeper seemed to sense her decision. As Clara spoke softly to him about her plans, his restless movement against the chains subsided into patient attention. For the first time since she'd found him, he settled completely to rest. as if understanding that his long vigil was finally approaching its end. Clara's discovery of Roberto's medicine bottle changed everything about the urgency of their situation. She found it on her fifth morning while conducting one final search of the campsite before beginning the hike back to her truck for bolt cutters. The small amber container had rolled beneath a thorn bush, its label sun-faded but still legible enough to make Clara's heart race with alarm. The prescription was for nitroglycerin tablets, used for emergency treatment of heart episodes, and the dates on the label showed it had been filled just 2 weeks before Roberto's disappearance. The bottle was nearly empty, with only 3 tablets remaining from what had obviously been a full prescription. Clara's veterinary training hadn't included human medicine, but she understood enough to recognize the implications. Roberto had been managing a serious cardiac condition and was likely traveling without adequate emergency medication. The discovery transformed Roberto's absence from a planned wilderness retreat into a potential medical emergency. A 78-year-old man with advanced heart disease, hiking alone in rugged terrain without sufficient medication, represented exactly the kind of scenario that required immediate rescue intervention. Clara's moral obligation shifted from respecting his end-of-life wishes to ensuring he received necessary medical care. Keeper's reaction to Clara's discovery of the medicine bottle confirmed her worst fears. When she approached him with the container, allowing him to smell the familiar scent of Roberto's medication, the donkey's distress became unmistakable. He began pulling against his chains with desperate energy, making urgent vocalizations that sounded almost like attempts at human speech. His behavior suggested not just recognition, but active communication. He was trying to tell Clara that Roberto needed help. Immediately, Clara's decision-making process compressed into minutes rather than hours. Roberto's condition could deteriorate rapidly without proper medication, and every day of delay potentially reduced his chances of survival. The round trip to her truck for bolt cutters would consume an entire day, time that Roberto might not have. She needed a solution that would free Keeper immediately while maintaining her ability to communicate with emergency services. The answer came from an unexpected source. Clara's hiking pack contained a small emergency flare gun, standard equipment for wilderness travelers who might need to signal rescue aircraft. The flare gun's projectile, while designed for signaling rather than cutting, generated enough heat and impact to potentially weaken chain links that had been stressed by Keeper's movement over several weeks. It was dangerous and uncertain, but it represented their only immediate option for mobility. Clara spent an hour preparing for the attempt, moving her gear to a safe distance and ensuring Keeper was positioned to minimize his exposure to sparks and debris. She explained her plan to the donkey in the same calm tone she'd used throughout their time together, watching his ears track her voice and his eyes remain focused on her face. His trust in her competence was absolute, a confidence that made Clara more nervous than any technical challenge she'd ever faced. The first flare struck the chain link closest to the tree, generating a shower of sparks and a metallic ring that echoed off the canyon walls. The heat was intense but brief, and Clara could see stress fractures appearing in the metal even though the link hadn't completely separated. Keeper remained calm throughout the process, flinching only slightly when sparks landed near his hooves. The second flare completed what the first had begun. The stressed chain link separated with a sharp crack, leaving Keeper free for the first time in weeks. His reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of bolting or celebrating his freedom, he moved directly to Clara's side and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that made her throat tighten with emotion. With Keeper mobile, Clara quickly assembled a stripped-down pack containing emergency medical supplies, Roberto's remaining heart medication, water for 3 people, and her satellite phone. The donkey's behavior indicated urgency, and she trusted his instincts more than her own about Roberto's location. They would follow the southwestern trail as far as it led, using Keeper's knowledge of the terrain to guide their search. The trail Keeper chose was more challenging than Clara had anticipated. It led through increasingly technical terrain, requiring careful navigation around loose rock formations and steep inclines that tested both human and animal endurance. But Keeper moved with confidence and purpose, choosing routes that suggested intimate familiarity with the landscape. His pace was steady but urgent, and Clara found herself pushing to match his determination. 3 hours into their search, Keeper's behavior changed dramatically. He began moving more cautiously, his ears constantly rotating to track sounds Clara couldn't hear. His vocalizations became softer but more frequent, and he frequently paused to test the air with his sensitive nose. They were getting close to something, and Keeper's body language suggested it was significant. The discovery came as they rounded a bend where the trail descended toward a natural amphitheater formed by converging canyon walls. Keeper stopped abruptly, his entire body tensing, as he stared toward a cluster of boulders that provided shelter from the afternoon sun. Clara followed his gaze and saw what had captured his attention, a flash of blue, fabric that didn't belong to the natural landscape. Clara approached the boulder cluster with her heart hammering against her ribs. Roberto was there, conscious but clearly in distress, propped against a rock wall in the shade of an overhang that provided natural shelter. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes remained alert and focused. When he saw Keeper approaching with Clara, his expression shifted through surprise, relief, and what appeared to be profound gratitude. "You found him," Roberto whispered, his voice weak but steady. "I was afraid he would wait forever." Clara knelt beside the elderly man, her veterinary training automatically assessing his condition while her heart processed the emotional weight of their reunion. Roberto was dehydrated and obviously weak, but his breathing was steady and his mental clarity appeared intact. The medicine bottle in Clara's pack represented immediate relief for his cardiac symptoms. But getting him to proper medical care would require careful planning and significant physical effort. Keeper's approach to Roberto was gentle and deliberate. The donkey lowered his head to receive the elderly man's trembling touch, standing perfectly still while Roberto ran his hands over the familiar coat and whispered words of affection in Spanish. The reunion between man and animal carried the weight of genuine love, tested by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "I thought I had more time," Roberto explained as Clara helped him take his medication. "I wanted to reach the place where Isabella and I used to camp, to spend my last days somewhere that held good memories. But my heart had other plans." Clara understood then that Roberto hadn't simply become lost. He had suffered a cardiac episode while hiking to a destination that held spiritual significance. His survival for nearly a week in this exposed location spoke to his wilderness experience and stubborn determination. But his condition was clearly deteriorating. What Clara discovered in the hidden cave sanctuary behind Roberto's shelter challenged every assumption she had made about his disappearance and intentions. Roberto, strengthened by his heart medication and Keeper's presence, insisted on showing her what he called the place where endings become beginnings. The cave entrance was concealed behind a curtain of desert vegetation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, Clara found herself in a natural cathedral carved by centuries of water flow through limestone. But this wasn't just a geological wonder. Roberto had transformed the space into something that defied easy categorization. The cave walls were lined with carefully arranged shelves carved from stone, each one holding items that told the story of a life lived with intention and love. Photographs covered one entire wall, chronicling Roberto's relationship with Isabella from her birth through their wilderness adventures. Clara saw the progression from baby pictures to hiking photos to formal school portraits, each image carefully preserved in waterproof containers. But it was the final photograph that stopped Clara's breath. Isabella at age 12, arms around Keeper's neck, both of them grinning at the camera, with the canyon landscape stretching endlessly behind them. This was her favorite place, Roberto said softly, settling onto a cushion he had obviously placed for comfort during long visits. We came here every summer for 4 years. She called it her thinking cave, because the acoustics made whispers echo like prayers. After the accident, I couldn't bear to come back. But when the doctors gave me their timeline, I knew this was where I wanted to spend whatever time remained. Clara explored the cave with growing wonder and dawning comprehension. Roberto hadn't simply fled to the wilderness to die. He had created a shrine, a place where memory and mortality could coexist peacefully. Shelves held Isabella's favorite books, carefully preserved in plastic containers. Her hiking gear, sized for a child, but obviously well used, occupied a place of honor near the cave's natural altar. But it was Roberto's own preparations that revealed the true complexity of his planning. The cave contained enough supplies for months of self-sufficient living. Water storage containers, non-perishable foods, medical supplies, and camping equipment suited for long-term residence. This wasn't the preparation of someone planning suicide. It was the careful arrangement of someone choosing the circumstances and location of a natural death. I have maybe 2 months left. According to the doctors, Roberto explained, as Clara examined his provisions. Maybe less if my heart decides to accelerate the schedule. I wanted to spend that time here with Isabella's memory, letting Keeper visit when his chains allowed. I thought it would be peaceful, a good death in a place filled with love. Clara's understanding of Roberto's decision deepened as he shared more details. His careful legal preparations hadn't just addressed Keeper's future ownership. They had been designed to ensure his own final wishes were respected. He had chosen this cave not for dramatic reasons, but for practical ones: natural shelter, reliable water source, and proximity to the place where his chains kept Keeper safe for eventual discovery. But something went wrong, Clara said. More statement than question. Roberto nodded, his weathered hands stroking Keeper's neck as the donkey pressed close to his side. My heart episode came sooner than expected while I was hiking back to visit Keeper. I made it this far but couldn't complete the return journey. I've been trapped here for 5 days, watching him from a distance, knowing he was waiting for me to come back. The moral complexity of the situation settled over Clara like a physical weight. Roberto hadn't abandoned Keeper. He had been prevented from returning by the same medical condition that had driven him to seek this remote sanctuary. His chains weren't cruel restraint, but desperate insurance that Keeper would remain discoverable when Roberto could no longer care for him. Everything Clara had interpreted as problematic had actually been motivated by profound love and careful planning. Roberto's journal, which he kept in the cave, revealed the depth of his daily struggle with his decision. Entries described his morning visits to Keeper, his afternoon time with Isabella's memory, and his evening preparation for whatever form his death might take. But they also revealed increasing concern about Keeper's welfare as Roberto's cardiac episodes became more frequent and his ability to make the daily journey became uncertain. I chained him because I knew I was becoming unreliable, Roberto admitted. If I died during one of my visits here, he would have followed me into places where rescue might never find him. The chains ensured he would wait in a location where help could reach him, even if I couldn't return to release him myself. Clara felt her perspective shifting as she absorbed Roberto's true story. This wasn't a case of animal abandonment requiring her intervention. It was a carefully planned end-of-life arrangement that had been disrupted by medical emergency. Roberto had intended to manage his own death with dignity while ensuring Keeper's safety. But circumstances had forced him into a situation where both man and animal were suffering unnecessarily. The cave's most remarkable feature was revealed when Roberto lit a series of candles placed strategically around the walls. The flickering light revealed paintings, not professional artwork, but heartfelt recreations of memories Roberto cherished. Isabella feeding Keeper treats, the three of them hiking together. Quiet moments of companionship that had sustained Roberto through years of grief. I'm not ready to die yet, Roberto said quietly, the admission carrying the weight of profound honesty. I thought I was. I thought spending my final time here would bring peace. But watching Keeper suffer because of my choices, knowing he doesn't understand why I can't come back to him, it's made me realize that choosing the time and place of death is more complicated than I anticipated. Clara knelt beside Roberto and Keeper, feeling the weight of decisions that extended far beyond her original intention to rescue an abandoned animal. Roberto's revelation that he wasn't ready to die changed everything about their situation. His elaborate preparations for a peaceful death in Isabella's favorite place had been disrupted by the reality that letting go required different timing than he had anticipated. What if there was another way? Clara asked carefully. What if you didn't have to choose between staying here with Isabella's memory and taking care of Keeper? What if you could have both? Roberto's eyes met hers with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He had spent months planning for one kind of ending, and Clara was suggesting the possibility of an entirely different narrative. But as Keeper pressed closer to both humans, creating a circle of warmth in the cool cave air, Roberto seemed to consider that his story might not be finished after all. The cave that Roberto had prepared as his final resting place might instead become the beginning of an unexpected chapter, one that included Clara as a partner in caring for both his memory of Isabella and his beloved Keeper. The supplies, the legal preparations, the carefully constructed shrine could all serve new purposes if Roberto chose life over death, companionship over solitude. As night fell outside the cave entrance, the three companions settled into an arrangement that felt both temporary and permanent. Roberto had found the strength to continue. Clara had found a purpose that extended beyond her own healing, and Keeper had been reunited with the human he had waited for with such patient faith. The morning after Roberto's revelation brought decisions that would reshape all their futures. Clara woke in the cave sanctuary to find Roberto carefully reviewing the handwritten will he had prepared months earlier, his weathered fingers tracing lines of text that no longer reflected his current intentions. Keeper stood near the cave entrance, silhouetted against the growing dawn light, as if keeping watch over the two humans who had become his responsibility as much as he was theirs. I wrote this thinking I understood what I wanted, Roberto said, holding up the document that legally transferred Keeper's ownership to Clara after 30 days of demonstrated care. But lying here for 5 days, watching him wait for me to return, made me realize I was trying to solve my grief by running away from life itself. Isabella would never forgive me for abandoning Keeper, even with the best intentions. Clara studied Roberto's face, reading the exhaustion and pain that couldn't be completely masked by his renewed determination. His cardiac medication had stabilized his immediate symptoms, but his overall condition remained fragile. The hiking and emotional stress of the past week had taken a toll that would require careful management and probably professional medical attention to address safely. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction of his thoughts. "I'm thinking that maybe the answer isn't choosing between caring for Keeper and honoring Isabella's memory," Roberto replied. "Maybe the answer is finding a way to do both, with help from someone who understands what's at stake." The implications of Roberto's shift in perspective rippled through Clara's mind like stones dropped in still water. She had entered this situation expecting to rescue an abandoned animal and return to her planned life of solitary healing. Instead, she had discovered a complex family story that included her as a crucial participant rather than a temporary helper. Roberto's will could be modified to reflect their new arrangement, but the emotional and practical commitments involved were far more complex than any legal document could address. Clara spent the morning inventorying Roberto's cave supplies while he rested, and Keeper grazed on the sparse vegetation near the entrance. The quantity and quality of provisions revealed the depth of Roberto's original planning. Enough food and water for several months, medical supplies beyond basic first aid, and camping equipment designed for comfort rather than mere survival. He had intended to live in this sacred space, not simply die in it, but Roberto's health concerns couldn't be ignored. His cardiac episodes were unpredictable and potentially fatal without immediate medical intervention. The cave's remote location, while spiritually meaningful, was impractical for someone requiring regular medical monitoring. Any arrangement that honored both Roberto's desires and Keeper's welfare would need to balance accessibility with the solitude that made this place special. "I have an idea," Clara said as they shared lunch prepared over Roberto's camp stove. "What if we think about this place as a retreat rather than a residence? Somewhere you and Keeper could visit regularly but not live permanently. I could help you establish a base closer to medical care, somewhere that would let you spend time here safely." Roberto's response was immediate interest, tempered by practical concerns. His fixed income and declining health made major lifestyle changes challenging, but Clara's proposal offered possibilities he hadn't considered. The legal transfer of Keeper's ownership could be modified to reflect shared responsibility rather than complete transfer, creating a partnership that benefited everyone involved. The afternoon was spent planning a careful evacuation from the cave that would preserve Roberto's strength while ensuring Keeper's safety on the challenging terrain. Clara's hiking experience and Roberto's intimate knowledge of the canyon system created a strategic combination, but the physical demands of the journey would test Roberto's cardiac condition and Clara's wilderness first aid skills. Roberto insisted on personally packing the items from Isabella's shrine, handling each photograph and memento with reverence that made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. His grief was still profound, but it had transformed from the desperate escape that had driven him to this cave into something more sustainable, a love that could coexist with continued living rather than requiring death to honor properly. She would want Keeper to be happy, Roberto said as he carefully wrapped Isabella's favorite hiking boots in protective cloth. "And she would want me to be the grandfather who chose life even when life became difficult. I lost sight of that in my pain, but finding you here, seeing how you cared for Keeper without knowing anything about us, it reminded me that Isabella's love was meant to be shared, not buried." The practical challenges of their new arrangement began to clarify as the day progressed. Roberto would need accessible housing near medical facilities, while Clara's remote work capabilities could allow her to provide support while maintaining her income. Keeper would benefit from having two humans committed to his welfare, creating redundancy that ensured his care, even if one of them faced health or life challenges. Clara's satellite phone, when she climbed to higher ground for better reception, connected her to the outside world she had left behind a week ago. Her employer expressed concern about her extended absence, but agreed to additional remote work flexibility given the circumstances. Her sister Jenny was less understanding, viewing Clara's involvement with Roberto and Keeper as another example of avoiding her own life problems by focusing on dramatic rescues. "You can't save everyone," Jenny said through the crackling connection. "And you definitely can't adopt a random old man and his donkey because you found them in the mountains." But Clara's response surprised them both with its clarity. "I'm not trying to save anyone. I'm trying to build something meaningful with people who understand that family doesn't always look like what we planned." The conversation with Dr. Martinez at the veterinary clinic provided professional validation for their emerging arrangement. Keeper's health records supported the shared ownership approach, and Dr. Martinez offered to coordinate with medical professionals in Santa Fe to ensure Roberto received appropriate cardiac care. The veterinarian's enthusiasm for their solution reinforced Clara's growing confidence that they were making the right decision. Evening brought the completion of Roberto's legal modifications to Keeper's ownership transfer. Instead of complete transfer to Clara, the document now reflected joint ownership with shared responsibilities and decision-making authority. The arrangement protected Keeper's welfare while honoring Roberto's deep emotional investment in the animal's future. Clara's signature on the modified document felt like accepting adoption into a family she hadn't known she wanted. Roberto's stories about Isabella filled the cave with warmth as they prepared for their final night in the sanctuary. He spoke about her fearless approach to hiking, her insistence on naming every animal they encountered, her absolute conviction that Keeper understood every word spoken to him. The grief in his voice had transformed from desperate pain into sustainable sadness, still profound but no longer requiring escape to be bearable. Keeper's behavior throughout the day had been remarkable. The donkey seemed to understand that significant changes were occurring, and his attention shifted constantly between Roberto and Clara, as if monitoring their emotional states. His obvious contentment with their partnership validated their decision in ways that rational planning couldn't achieve, as they settled into sleeping arrangements that accommodated 3 different sleep schedules and comfort needs. Clara reflected on the transformation her solitary hiking retreat had undergone. She had sought healing through wilderness solitude, and instead discovered that healing sometimes required accepting unexpected responsibilities and relationships. Her post-divorce independence hadn't been compromised by caring for Roberto and Keeper. It had been redefined in ways that made it more meaningful. The cave sanctuary that Roberto had prepared as his final resting place had instead become the birthplace of an unconventional family bound together by compassion, shared responsibility, and love for an animal who had waited patiently for rescue that arrived in forms none of them had anticipated. Tomorrow would bring the challenging journey back to civilization, but tonight they were complete. Man, woman, and donkey sharing space made sacred by memory, hope, and the simple recognition that some bonds transcend conventional definitions. Roberto's final journal entry that night reflected his transformed perspective. Isabella brought Clara to us when we needed her most. Tomorrow, we begin a new chapter that honors the past while embracing whatever future we can build together. The challenging journey out of the canyon began before dawn, when cool air and Roberto's peak energy levels offered the best conditions for the demanding trek ahead. Clara had spent hours the previous evening studying topographical maps and planning a route that balanced efficiency with Roberto's physical limitations. Keeper's custom pack harness, discovered among Roberto's carefully maintained gear, would allow the donkey to carry essential supplies while providing stability support for Roberto during the most difficult passages. The pack harness was a masterpiece of practical design, clearly handmade with Roberto's carpentry skills and intimate knowledge of Keeper's build and temperament. Leather straps showed wear patterns that spoke of years of use, and metal fittings had been chosen for durability rather than weight savings. When Clara fitted the harness to Keeper's shoulders, the donkey stood perfectly still, obviously familiar with the equipment and eager to resume his role as Roberto's hiking partner. Roberto's condition that morning was better than Clara had dared hope. The combination of rest, proper medication, and emotional relief had stabilized his cardiac symptoms enough to attempt the journey. But Clara's veterinary experience with animal physiology made her acutely aware of the warning signs to watch for: changes in breathing pattern, unusual skin color, or altered mental clarity that would indicate immediate medical emergency. The first 2 hours of hiking proceeded smoothly, with Keeper setting a deliberate pace that accommodated Roberto's need for frequent rest stops. The donkey's intelligence was remarkable. He seemed to sense exactly when Roberto needed to pause, choosing level spots with adequate seating and shade. His behavior suggested years of experience managing Roberto's health concerns during their wilderness adventures. But as they reached the steeper terrain that marked the canyon's exit route, weather conditions began deteriorating in ways that transformed their careful planning into crisis management. The clear skies that had blessed their morning gave way to the kind of rapidly building thunderstorm that could turn desert hiking from challenging to deadly within minutes. Clara's hiking experience included extensive training in weather hazard recognition, and the signs were unmistakable. The sudden drop in temperature, the way sound carried differently through the increasingly humid air, the distinct electricity that made hair stand on end. They were facing a potentially dangerous storm, with hours of exposure remaining before reaching shelter. Roberto's response to the weather crisis revealed both his wilderness expertise and his physical vulnerability. He understood the danger better than Clara did, having spent decades learning to read desert storm patterns. But his cardiac condition meant that the stress of rapid weather changes posed additional risks beyond simple exposure to rain and lightning. "We need to find immediate shelter," Roberto said, his voice steady despite obvious fatigue. "These canyon storms can create flash floods that make hiking impossible for hours." Clara's pack contained emergency shelter supplies, but they were designed for planned camping rather than crisis protection. Roberto's knowledge of the terrain became crucial as he directed them toward a natural overhang that would provide adequate protection from rain while keeping them away from potential flood zones. The makeshift shelter Roberto chose was perfect for their needs, a limestone overhang deep enough to accommodate all three of them plus their gear, positioned on high ground that would remain safe even during significant water flow. But reaching it required navigating increasingly treacherous terrain as the first heavy raindrops began falling and wind made footing uncertain keepers' performance during the weather. Emergency was nothing short of heroic. The donkeys seemed to understand the urgency of their situation without becoming panicked or difficult to manage. His sure footing on wet rock surfaces and intuitive route-finding ability guided them safely to shelter just as the storm reached full intensity. The hours spent waiting out the storm in their cramped shelter created an unexpected intimacy between the three companions. Roberto shared stories about previous adventures with Keeper, describing the donkey's remarkable intelligence and loyalty during challenging situations. Clara contributed her own tales of wilderness emergencies, and gradually they developed the kind of easy conversation that comes from shared danger successfully navigated. But Roberto's condition during the storm layover concerned Clara more than she wanted to admit. The stress and exertion had clearly taken a toll, and she found herself conducting subtle medical assessments while maintaining conversation that wouldn't alarm him. His color remained good and his breathing steady, but his overall energy was obviously declining when the storm finally passed, leaving behind clear skies and the kind of crystal-pure air that only follows desert thunderstorms. They emerged from shelter to find their remaining route transformed by runoff and standing water. What had been challenging hiking was now potentially dangerous, requiring careful navigation around washouts and newly created obstacles. Clara made the decision to use her emergency satellite beacon to contact search and rescue services. Roberto's condition, combined with the terrain challenges created by the storm, had pushed their situation beyond what they could safely manage alone. Professional assistance would ensure Roberto received appropriate medical evaluation, while removing the time pressure that was adding stress to an already challenging evacuation, the helicopter rescue that arrived 3 hours after Clara's emergency beacon activation represented the intersection of modern technology and ancient wilderness wisdom. The rescue crew, experienced in desert emergency medicine, immediately recognized the complexity of their situation. Not just a medical evacuation, but the careful extraction of an elderly man, a woman and a donkey who had become an inseparable family unit during their week in the canyon. The rescue blanket that the emergency medical technician wrapped around Roberto was made of space-age, reflective material designed to maintain body temperature during transport. But Clara couldn't help thinking about how the metallic surface caught and reflected light, like the scales of some mythical creature. The blanket became a symbol of how modern intervention and ancient wilderness wisdom could work together for healing, rather than competing with each other. Roberto's vital signs, when the EMT conducted a thorough assessment, were stable but concerning. His cardiac condition required immediate professional evaluation, and the stress of the past week had clearly taken a toll that would need careful management. But his mental clarity remained sharp, and his primary concern was ensuring that Keeper would be cared for during his absence. "Promise me you'll stay with him," Roberto said to Clara as the rescue team prepared for departure. His weathered hand gripped hers with surprising strength, and his eyes held the intensity of someone making a request that went far beyond simple animal care. "He doesn't understand why people leave. After Isabella, after this week of waiting, he needs to know that someone will always come back." Clara's promise carried the weight of a sacred vow. She understood that Roberto wasn't just asking her to watch his donkey. He was asking her to become the guardian of everything Keeper represented about loyalty, patience, and unconditional love. The responsibility felt enormous, but it also felt like the purpose she had been searching for without knowing it. The helicopter departure was emotional in ways that Clara hadn't anticipated. As the aircraft lifted Roberto away from the canyon that had nearly become his final resting place, Keeper's distress was immediate and heartbreaking. The donkey pulled against Clara's gentle restraint, making vocalizations that sounded remarkably like crying. His entire body language expressing the fear that his beloved human was disappearing forever. Clara's response was instinctive and effective. She knelt beside Keeper, pressing her forehead against his neck and speaking in the same calm tone she had used throughout their time together. "He's going to get better," she whispered, more for her own reassurance than for the donkey's understanding. "And we're going to take care of each other until he comes back." Keeper's gradual calming was testament to the trust that had developed between them during their shared vigil. The donkey remained alert and watchful as the helicopter disappeared over the canyon rim, but his breathing steadied and his trembling subsided. Clara realized that her role had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer a temporary caregiver, but Keeper's primary emotional support during Roberto's absence. The quiet journey to Clara's truck, parked miles away at the original trailhead, allowed both human and animal to process the morning's dramatic events. Keeper's behavior was subdued but trusting, and Clara found herself maintaining a constant stream of gentle conversation that seemed to comfort them both. She described their plans for the coming weeks, Roberto's expected recovery, and the new arrangements they would build together. Clara's truck, when they finally reached it after hours of careful hiking, represented the boundary between their wilderness experience and the return to civilized life. Loading Keeper into the horse trailer she had hastily borrowed from a fellow hiker represented a leap of faith for an animal who had spent years associating vehicle transport with separations and losses, but Keeper's trust in Clara had grown strong enough to overcome his anxiety about travel. The donkey loaded willingly, standing calmly during the drive to Santa Fe while Clara spoke to him through the trailer's communication window. His acceptance of this major transition confirmed that their bond had become strong enough to support the challenges ahead. The veterinary clinic where Dr. Martinez examined Keeper provided confirmation that Roberto's care had been excellent. Despite the unusual circumstances, Keeper was in good health for his age, showing signs of recent stress but no permanent damage from his week of waiting in the canyon. Dr. Martinez's examination also revealed something that made Clara smile, evidence of recent grooming and hoof care that could only have been provided by Clara during their time. "Together, you've done remarkable work with him," Dr. Martinez said as Keeper stood calmly for his examination. "He's obviously bonded with you completely. Roberto will be so relieved to know Keeper has found someone who understands his needs." Clara's phone call to the hospital where Roberto was receiving cardiac evaluation brought news that was cautiously optimistic. His condition had stabilized with proper medication and rest, but the cardiologist recommended a structured rehabilitation program that would require several weeks of supervised care. Roberto's first concern, according to the nurse Clara spoke with, had been Keeper's welfare rather than his own recovery timeline. The temporary arrangement Clara established at a small ranch outside Santa Fe reflected the practical needs of their unusual situation. The property owner, a retired teacher named Maria Santos, had experience with rescue animals and offered boarding that included daily care and companionship for Keeper. But Clara's daily visits quickly became the highlight of both her schedule and Keeper's routine. Each evening, after completing her remote work responsibilities, Clara drove to the ranch to spend time with Keeper. Their routine included grooming, gentle exercise, and the kind of quiet companionship that had sustained them through their week in the canyon. Keeper's obvious joy at her arrival confirmed that their bond had become permanent rather than situational. The transformation in Clara's life was subtle but profound. Her post-divorce apartment, which had felt like temporary shelter rather than home, began to reflect the presence of someone who had found purpose beyond simple survival. Roberto's legal documents, Keeper's veterinary records, and photographs from their canyon adventure created tangible evidence of a new kind of family that didn't fit conventional definitions but felt more authentic than anything Clara had experienced during her marriage. Roberto's release from the hospital after 2 weeks brought the reunion Clara and Keeper had both been anticipating. The elderly man was frailer than before his cardiac episode, but his spirit had been strengthened by the knowledge that Keeper had been well cared for in his absence. The three-way embrace that included human, and donkey felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken by circumstance and mended by choice. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Roberto said as they sat together in the ranch's afternoon shade, Keeper contentedly grazing nearby. "My doctor says I can't live alone anymore, and I can't afford the kind of care facility that would let me keep Keeper nearby." But maybe that's not the problem I thought it was. Clara's understanding of Roberto's meaning was immediate and mutual. The solution to his housing and care needs didn't require institutional placement. It required the kind of creative family arrangement that could accommodate an elderly man, a middle-aged woman, and a donkey who had brought them together. The legal framework already existed in their shared ownership documents, and the emotional foundation had been tested by circumstances that revealed their compatibility under stress. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Clara asked, though her smile indicated she already knew the answer. 3 months after their rescue from the canyon, Clara stood in the pasture behind the small ranch house she now shared with Roberto and Keeper, watching the morning sun paint the Sangre de Cristo mountains in shades of gold and rose. The new leather halter she had commissioned for Keeper gleamed with brass fittings and bore his name, engraved in careful script, a symbol of permanence and belonging that reflected how completely their lives had intertwined. The ranch house itself was modest, but perfectly suited to their unconventional family arrangement. Roberto's bedroom on the ground floor accommodated his mobility needs, while Clara's upstairs office allowed her to continue her remote work with a view of the pasture where Keeper spent his days. The kitchen they shared had become the heart of their home, where Roberto's stories of Isabella mixed with Clara's tales of corporate database management and Keeper's presence at the back door created a rhythm of daily life that felt both surprising and inevitable. Roberto's recovery had progressed better than anyone had dared hope. His cardiologist attributed his improvement not just to proper medication, but to the sense of purpose that came from having meaningful responsibilities and genuine companionship. His morning routine of caring for Keeper, combined with Clara's assistance with heavier tasks, had given him reasons to maintain his strength and mobility that medical intervention alone couldn't provide. Clara's own transformation was equally profound, but more subtle. The driven efficiency that had characterized her corporate work remained, but it was now balanced by the slower rhythms of animal care and the patient conversations that filled evening hours. Her sister Jenny, during a recent visit, had commented that Clara seemed more settled than she had in years, not the brittle control of someone holding themselves together. but the genuine peace of someone who had found their proper place. Keeper's adaptation to their new life was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. The patient, loyal animal who had waited so faithfully by the cottonwood tree had blossomed into a creature of obvious contentment and security. His morning greetings to Clara and Roberto were enthusiastic but gentle. His afternoon explorations of the pasture were thorough, but always within sight of the house. And his evening presence during their outdoor dinners felt like the blessing of a creature who finally understood that home was permanent. The visits to Isabella's Canyon Sanctuary had become a monthly pilgrimage that honored memory while celebrating continued life. Roberto's carefully maintained shrine remained intact, but it was now a place of gratitude rather than grief, somewhere to share stories about Isabella with Clara, to show Keeper the trails they had all walked together, to acknowledge the past while building toward whatever future their unusual family might create. Dr. Martinez's quarterly examinations confirmed that Keeper was thriving under their joint care. The donkey's weight had stabilized at healthy levels. His coat gleamed with proper nutrition and regular grooming, and his behavior reflected the deep contentment of an animal whose security was never in question. The veterinarian often commented that Keeper seemed younger than his age, as if having two devoted humans had somehow reversed the effects of stress and uncertainty. Clara's work life had adapted to accommodate their family responsibilities in ways that surprised her with their sustainability. Her employer, initially concerned about her extended absence, had discovered that her wilderness experience with crisis management and resource allocation had improved her professional skills. The flexibility of remote work allowed her to maintain her income while being present for Roberto's medical appointments and Keeper's daily care needs. The legal arrangements that had begun as emergency measures had evolved into a comprehensive family structure that protected everyone's interests while honoring their emotional bonds. Roberto's updated will reflected his desire for Clara and Keeper to remain together permanently, while Clara's own estate planning now included provisions for Keeper's lifetime care. Their shared ownership of the ranch property provided security for Roberto's remaining years while giving Clara the stability she had been seeking since her divorce. But it was the unexpected discovery that brought their story full circle. During one of their monthly visits to the canyon, Clara and Roberto found another animal in distress, a young Mustang with an injured leg, clearly separated from his herd and unable to fend for himself in the harsh desert environment. Keeper's immediate interest in the wild horse, combined with Roberto's knowledge of animal rescue procedures and Clara's veterinary background, made their response both instinctive and effective. The rescue of the Mustang, whom they named Esperanza for the hope he represented, marked Clara's complete transformation from a woman seeking solitude to someone who had become a guardian of creatures who needed champions. The process of rehabilitating Esperanza's injury, working with wildlife authorities to ensure proper care, and ultimately finding him placement with a qualified rescue organization felt like the natural extension of skills and compassion that had brought Clara, Roberto, and Keeper together. As evening settled over their ranch, Clara found herself reflecting on the unpredictable journey that had led from a planned solo hiking retreat to this moment of profound contentment. Roberto dozed in his chair on the porch, his breathing steady and peaceful. Keeper grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on his humans before returning to the business of being a well-loved donkey. Esperanza's successful placement had been celebrated that afternoon with Roberto's stories, and Clara's quiet satisfaction at work. Well done. The leather halter that had symbolized Clara's commitment to Keeper's welfare had become something larger, a representation of how taking responsibility for one creature's needs had opened doors to purposes and relationships she had never imagined. The woman who had sought healing through wilderness solitude had discovered that healing sometimes required accepting the kind of love that came with strings attached. responsibilities that felt like privileges, and family bonds that defied conventional definitions but created meaning beyond anything she had experienced. In the growing darkness, with desert sounds replacing daytime activity and stars beginning to emerge in the vast New Mexico sky, Clara understood that some journeys end exactly where they need to, even when the destination bears no resemblance to the original plan.